I was standing in the living room of my own home, the house I had bought with my own sweat over 25 years ago, and I couldn't believe what was happening right in front of me. My daughter-in-law Jennifer and my son David were staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mix of cold, determination, and something that almost seemed like contempt. Jennifer was holding a folder full of papers, one of those expensive leather folders she loved to flaunt, and David stood beside her with his arms crossed, practically blocking the exit from the room, as if preventing me from escaping the situation. It was a Thursday afternoon in early September. I remember every detail of that day because it was when my life completely changed direction. The sun was still shining through the living room windows, illuminating the family photos. I had scattered across the wall photos of happy times that now seemed to belong to a completely different life. I had just gotten home from the grocery store going to buy dinner because David had called earlier to say he needed to talk about something very important and would be home after work. I thought it was good news, maybe a promotion at his job, maybe. Jennifer was pregnant again, something that would justify that urgent tone in his voice. But when they arrived, when they entered my house with that strange energy, when Jennifer threw that folder on the coffee table in the living room with a force that made the picture frames tremble, I knew something was very wrong. Before I could even ask anything, before I could even take off my coat or offer something to drink, Jennifer opened the folder and spread the papers on the table as if she were giving some kind of business presentation. She began speaking in that firm, controlled voice. I knew well the voice she used when she was determined to get what she wanted, no matter the cost. She said they'd thought a lot about my situation, about me getting older and living alone in that big house, about how it would be better for everyone if I finally made an intelligent decision about my future. Intelligent was the exact word she used, as if every decision I'd made up until that point had been made by someone with no capacity for reason. David added that they were worried about me, that they'd noticed I'd been getting forgetful lately, that my house needed repairs. I clearly couldn't handle that. It was time for me to accept that I could no longer live independently. I stood there, still clutching the grocery bags, trying to process what I was hearing, trying to understand where all this talk had come from. True, I had just turned 63, but perfectly healthy, perfectly capable of taking care of myself, perfectly lucid and independent. I still worked as a nurse at a local hospital, had all my regular medical checkups, drove my car without problems, paid my bills on time, and kept my house clean and organized. There was absolutely no reason for them to be having this conversation with me, unless they had some other motivation behind their sudden concern. I slowly set the bags down, trying to remain calm, and asked exactly what they were proposing. That's when Jennifer picked up one of the documents from the table and held it out to me with a smile that didn't even reach her eyes. She said they had everything prepared, that I just needed to sign it, and this whole complicated situation will be resolved quickly and easily. I took the paper and began to read, but the words seemed to jumble in front of me, full of legal jargon I didn't fully understand. Power of attorney, transfer of property, financial guardianship, diminished mental capacity. All these words leaped off the paper like little bombs ready to explode in my face. I looked up from the document and looked at my son, the 36-year-old man I had raised alone after his father abandoned us when he was just 5. I looked at that face I knew so well, searching for some sign of the sweet boy he had been, the studious teenager, the young adult who always thanked me for everything I did for him. But all I saw was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized, someone who was looking at me as if I were an obstacle in his path, and not the mother who had sacrificed everything for him throughout his life. I asked quietly what exactly these papers meant. What would happen if I signed all of them? David sighed impatiently, as if dealing with a stubborn child, and explained that the documents transferred ownership of my house into his and Jennifer's names, gave me full power of attorney over all my finances, and established that they would be my legal guardians should it be determined that I no longer had the capacity to make my own decisions. I could live in the house as long as I lived, he quickly added, as if this were some kind of generous concession, but legally the house would be theirs. and they could make all financial decisions for me. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. They wanted me to sign my entire life over to them, to hand over everything. I'd built over decades of hard work to place myself completely under their control, and they were presenting this as if it were for my own good, as if they were doing me a huge favor. I told them I needed time to think, that this was very serious and I needed to consult someone before making any decisions. That's when the mask of concern they'd been wearing completely slipped. Jennifer rose from the chair where she'd been sitting and came toward me with a stern expression on her face. She said there was no time to think, that this needed to be resolved now, today, right then. David also stood up, and for the first time since I'd walked into my house, he raised his voice at me. He yelled that I was being difficult, as always, that I never made anything easy for anyone, that they were tired of having to take care of me and my things. "Sign or you'll lose everything," were the exact words that came out of his mouth, spoken with an anger that made my heart freeze. Jennifer added that if I didn't sign voluntarily, they had other ways to get what they wanted, that they had spoken with lawyers and doctors who knew exactly how to proceed to declare me incompetent. She said it so coldly, so surely, that for a moment I was truly afraid. Afraid that they might actually succeed in doing what they were threatening. Afraid that I might lose everything without even fully understanding how afraid of ending my days somewhere I didn't choose under the control of people who clearly didn't truly care about me. I felt my hands begin to shake, not just from fear, but also from a deep anger that was beginning to build within me. Anger at myself for not having seen this coming. Anger at them for doing this. Anger at the whole situation. I saw them look at my shaking hands and saw that glint of satisfaction in their eyes, as if they were absolutely certain they were winning that. I was finally going to give in. Everyone in that room, especially the two of them, was certain. I was finished, that there was nowhere to run, that this was the end for me. But it was precisely at that moment, when all seemed lost, when it seemed like I truly had no way out, that something inside me changed completely. I stopped staring at the papers on the table and raised my eyes to face David and Jennifer. I took a deep breath, felt my racing heart begin to calm, and for the first time since they'd started that whole conversation, I smiled. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was a genuine smile, the kind that comes from within. When you finally understand something very important. I smiled because at that exact moment I remembered something crucial, something I'd done exactly 2.5 weeks ago. I smiled because I realized their entire plan was about to fall apart in a way they could never have imagined. And it was exactly as I smiled like that, with that strange calm amidst all that tension, that the door to the room opened. Robert Miller, my lawyer, a 62-year-old man with graying hair and a posture that exuded authority and confidence, entered the room with his brown leather briefcase under his arm. He had a key to my house because I'd given it to him a few weeks ago, when I'd started suspecting something like this might happen. Jennifer's expression changed so quickly that under other circumstances it would have been almost comical. The confident smile disappeared instantly, giving way to a look of pure shock and then barely concealed panic. David went pale as a sheet, his mouth opened as if to say something, but no sound came out. They looked at Robert, then at me, then back at Robert, trying to understand what was happening, how this was possible. Robert said nothing at first, just walked calmly over to us, placed his briefcase on the table, next to the documents Jennifer had brought, and looked at them both with an expression that made it very clear he knew exactly what was going on. Well, he finally spoke in that deep, controlled voice. "It seems I arrived just in time." David was the first to recover from the shock, tried to smile and extend his hand to Robert as if they were old friends meeting by chance. "You said something about how nice it was to meet his mother's lawyer, about how they were just having a normal family conversation." Robert didn't accept the handshake, just continued to look at David with that serious expression, and said that this didn't sound at all like a normal family conversation, that it sounded much more like coercion and attempted fraud. The word fraud hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Jennifer began to stammer, saying there had been some misunderstanding, that they were just trying to help, that Robert was misinterpreting everything. But Robert simply picked up the documents on the table, those papers that minutes before had seemed like my death sentence, and began reading them line by line aloud. With each paragraph he read, the situation became clearer and more frightening. Those documents weren't just about transferring the house into their name, they were about completely stripping me of any control over my own life. They gave them complete power over every penny I had, over every medical decision, over where I would live, what I would eat, whether or not I could leave the house. It was essentially turning me into a prisoner in my own life, completely dependent on the goodwill of two people who clearly had no goodwill toward me whatsoever. When Robert finished reading, he carefully placed the papers back on the table and finally looked at me. He asked if I had signed anything, if I had verbally agreed to any of it. I nodded, my voice still struggling to come out. He nodded with satisfaction and then turned back to David and Jennifer. What happened next was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Robert began talking, not shouting, but with a firmness that made it clear he wasn't joking about all the laws. They were breaking about all the legal consequences they could face if they continued with this plan. He mentioned terms like elder financial abuse, coercion, proxy fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. With each legal term he mentioned, David seemed to shrink a little more, and Jennifer became increasingly agitated. At some point, she tried to interrupt Robert, trying to tell him he didn't understand the situation, that I really needed help, and they were family. Robert cut her off mid-sentence and said that if she truly cared about my well-being, she wouldn't be trying to force me to sign documents under threat and psychological pressure. He said that a family that truly cares, talks, seeks real medical help if there are concerns about mental capacity, and doesn't show up with ready-made paperwork demanding immediate signatures. David finally found his voice and tried to defend himself, saying they had every right to be concerned about his mother, that the house was indeed in need of repairs, that I had forgotten some things recently. Robert asked for specific examples, and David stammered, unable to give any concrete examples because they simply didn't exist. I wasn't forgetting anything. I wasn't having any mental capacity issues. It was all made up to justify what they wanted to do. That's when Robert reached for his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed the envelope on the table and said he had some information that David and Jennifer would probably like to know. He opened the envelope and began pulling out documents, and what came out of that envelope completely changed the dynamic of the room. They were copies of every bank statement from the past 8 years, highlighting every transfer I'd made to David, every check I'd written on their behalf, every payment I'd made. Robert had organized everything into a very clear timeline with the total for each year added up at the end. I'd given him rough figures when we first met, but seeing everything written out, documented, and organized chronologically was shocking even to me. The first year, right after David and Jennifer got married, it's given them $23,000 as a wedding gift, moving assistance, and some small loans. The second year had been a little less, $16,000 to help with their home renovations. The third year increased to $31,000 because Jennifer became pregnant, and I covered many of the layette and baby preparation expenses. The fourth year was the worst, $42,000, because David said he was having problems at work and needed urgent help paying bills. The fifth year was $18,000, the sixth was $24,000, the seventh was $27,000, and the eighth, the current year, had already reached $21,000 by that point. In total, over the 8 years since they were married, I had given them exactly $202,000. When Robert said that number out loud, $202,000 even, I was shocked because I had never added it all up like that. It was more money than I had earned in some entire years working as a nurse. It was practically my entire savings from 3 decades of hard work. It was my retirement fund, my security, my future, all drained over the years in small and large amounts for two people, who now stood before me trying to take what little I had left. Robert continued, saying that of the $202,000, only $12,000 had been formally loaned with some kind of repayment agreement. And even that was never repaid. Everything else had been given as gifts or assistance, always with the implicit or explicit promise that it would be temporary, that they were struggling. and that they would soon be in a better situation. But the better situation never arrived, or if it did, it didn't result in any kind of reciprocity or even a reduction in requests for help. Jennifer tried to argue that it had all been given freely, that no one had forced anything, that I had offered to help on all those occasions. And technically, she was right. I had offered to help many times. But Robert raised a very important point. Yes, I had given the money voluntarily, but always under the impression that I was helping. The family always believing that there would be gratitude and respect, never imagining it would be used against me in this way. He said that the fact that they were now trying to force the transfer of my remaining assets showed very clearly what their intention had been all along. It wasn't familial love, it wasn't genuine concern. It was simply prolonged financial exploitation trying to achieve its ultimate goal. David rose from his chair and began to agitate, pacing the room. He said it was all an exaggeration, that Robert was trying to destroy the family, that I was being manipulated to turn against my own son. That's when Robert pulled another document from his briefcase. And this was the one that really brought everything crashing down for them. It was a transcribed recording of a conversation David and Jennifer had had 3 weeks earlier at the office of a lawyer who had apparently refused to help them with their plan. It turned out that this lawyer, a man named Thomas Peterson, knew Robert from years of working together. And when David and Jennifer showed up at his office asking for help with exactly what they were trying to do to me, now he was so distraught that he recorded the consultation and then contacted Robert, who was already known in the local legal community for defending elder abuse cases. In the transcribed recording, everything was there in black and white. Jennifer saying they needed to act quickly before I spent all the remaining money or changed my mind about helping them. David saying the house was valued at $450,000 and that it would be a waste to leave all that money tied up there, and they had so many needs. Jennifer commenting that I would probably live another 20 years, so it would be better to get control of the assets. Now, while they could still enjoy them, David laughing and saying that at least after everything they had taken from me over the years, they deserved to keep the rest too. The word taken was there crystal clear, proving they knew exactly what they were doing, that this wasn't family support, this wasn't concern, this was planned and deliberate theft. When Robert finished reading the most relevant excerpts from the transcript, the silence in the room was absolute. Jennifer had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of anger and frustration at having been caught. David was sitting back down, his head in his hands, and when he lifted his face to look at me, there was something in his eyes I will never forget. It wasn't shame, it wasn't regret, it was pure resentment. He looked at me as if this was all my fault, as if I'd done something wrong by protecting myself. Robert then calmly explained what would happen next. He said David and Jennifer had 2 options. The first was to get up, leave my house, and never ask me for money again, or try any scheme to take my assets. In that case, he wouldn't take all that evidence to the police and the Bar Association, since the lawyer they'd consulted could lose his license for failing to report the attempted fraud immediately. The second option was to keep fighting, to continue with the threats and manipulation, in which case Robert would not only go to the police, but also file civil lawsuits for all the $200 and $2,000 I'd given him over the years, arguing that it had all been obtained under false pretenses and emotional manipulation. He said we probably wouldn't be able to get the money back because they'd already spent it all, but that it would certainly destroy any reputation they had left and possibly result in criminal charges that could lead to jail time. The choice was theirs, Robert said, but they had exactly 30 seconds to decide. The longest 30 seconds of my life passed in absolute silence. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Jennifer was the first to move, rising abruptly from her chair and grabbing her purse. She looked at me with an expression of pure hatred and told me I would regret this, that I was destroying the family for money, that Sophie would grow up knowing what kind of grandmother I really was. The mention of my granddaughter, of little Sophie, whom I loved so much and who was completely innocent in this whole situation, cut me like a knife. But before I could respond, Robert intervened, saying that any attempt at parental alienation, any effort to weaponize the child or manipulate our relationship, would also be reported to the appropriate authorities. David finally stood up to straighten his clothes as if preparing to leave a random business meeting and looked at me for the last time. What he said next I will never forget, not the words themselves, but the tone of his voice, the contempt, the complete lack of any real emotion. He said I had always been a selfish mother, always putting my needs above his, always hoarding what I had instead of sharing generously with the family. He said he had grown up watching other children whose parents gave everything for them, and that I had always been stingy, always counting every penny, always making it seem like helping was a huge sacrifice. The irony of those words, considering I'd literally given him $22,000 over the years, considering I'd worked 2 jobs for years to pay for his college education, considering everything I'd sacrificed to ensure he had a good life, was so absurd I almost laughed. But I didn't laugh, I just stood there listening to this man. I'd raised this man who had been my world for so long tell me I'd never been good enough for him. And then they left, walked to the door without looking back, and I heard their car start and pull away from my house. When the sound of the engine finally faded completely, my legs gave out and I had to sit down on the couch before I fell. Robert sat beside me and was silent for a while, giving me space to process everything that had just happened. I don't know how long we sat there in silence. It could have been 5 minutes, it could have been an hour. Eventually Robert spoke, his voice gentle but firm. He said I had done the right thing, that I know it didn't seem that way at the time, but that I had saved myself from a situation that would only have gotten worse. He explained that cases like mine were more common than people realized, that he saw it every week at his work. Adult children exploiting elderly parents, sometimes to the point of leaving them completely destitute. He said most victims never act, never protect themselves, because the emotional bond is so strong, because the fear of losing family is paralyzing. But I had acted, I had sought help, and because of that, I still had my home, still had some money, still had my independence and dignity. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in a fog. I kept going to work at the hospital, kept doing my daily tasks, but everything seemed to be happening in slow motion, as if I were watching my own life from the outside. I cried a lot in those first few weeks, cried for the loss of my relationship with my son, cried for the shattered illusion of a loving family, cried for all those years of being unknowingly used. But there was also a growing sense of relief, even liberation. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about when the next request for money would be, didn't have to make excuses about why I couldn't help financially, didn't have to feel that constant guilt of never doing enough. I could finally just live my life, take care of myself, make my own choices, without the weight of this constant expectation. Robert had given me some practical advice on how to proceed. He suggested I move all important documents to a bank safety deposit box that only I would have access to. He advised me to review my will and healthcare directive, making sure David wasn't listed as executor or as a person with medical decision-making power. He recommended I install security cameras around the house, just in case David and Jennifer tried anything. He suggested I consider therapy with someone who specializes in abusive family dynamics to help me process everything that had happened and recover emotionally. I followed all his advice, and every step I took to protect myself was also a step toward feeling stronger and more in control of my own life. Therapy, in particular, was transformative. My therapist, a wonderful woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, helped me understand patterns that had been present in my relationship with David since he was little. How I had always given in to his demands, always put his needs above my own, always felt I had to prove my love through material sacrifices. She helped me see that I hadn't been a selfish mother, as David had claimed, but in fact, I had been the opposite. I had been so devoted that I ended up raising a son who didn't know the value of things, who thought he deserved everything without having to give anything in return. For about 3 weeks after that fateful day, I heard nothing from David or Jennifer. No contact, no message, no contact of any kind. Part of me kept checking my phone compulsively, waiting for a message, waiting for an apology that never came. But then at the end of the third week, I received an email from David. It wasn't his personal email, it was from an address I'd never seen before, probably created specifically for this purpose. The email was short, formal, almost like a business communication. It said he and Jennifer had thought long and hard about the situation, that they felt they'd been misunderstood, but that, for now, they felt it best to maintain some distance. He also said Sophie was fine and that he would send me pictures of her occasionally. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd tried to do, just that cold, distant message. I responded to the email equally briefly, saying only that I respected their decision about distance, but that I would like to maintain some kind of contact with Sophie when appropriate. I didn't mention the money, I didn't mention the documents, I didn't mention anything about what had happened. I kept everything very neutral and factual following Robert's advice about not creating any more written documentation that could be used against me. Sophie's photos began arriving sporadically, maybe once every 2 weeks. They were always beautiful pictures of my granddaughter growing and developing, but seeing those images without being able to be present in her life was painful in a way that's hard to describe. I saved each photo, studied every detail, searching for clues about how she was doing, if she was happy, if she was being well cared for. In some weak moments, I considered responding to the emails, asking to see Sophie in person, begging for some kind of access to her. But Dr. Chen reminded me that this was exactly what David and Jennifer wanted. They wanted me desperate and willing to do anything for access to my granddaughter. Because as long as I was in this state, they would have power over me. So I forced myself to be patient, to wait, to trust that eventually things would work out somehow. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding my life in other ways. I had become so focused on being a mother and grandmother that I had neglected other areas of my life. I didn't have many close friends because I was always busy helping David with something. I didn't have any real hobbies because all my free time went to visiting Sophie or doing things for the family. I hadn't invested in myself in any meaningful way in years. But now I had time, I had space, and ironically, I even had a little more money each month because I wasn't constantly giving it to David and Jennifer. I started slowly joining a walking group at the hospital where I worked. It was a group of nurses and other staff who met 3 times a week before work to walk in the nearby park. At first it was strange. I wasn't used to doing things just for myself with no purpose beyond my own well-being. But gradually I began to enjoy those morning walks. The easy conversation with colleagues, the feeling of taking care of my body and my health. One of the nurses in the group, a woman named Patricia, who was about my age, became a close friend. She had gone through a difficult divorce a few years earlier and understood what it was like to rebuild your life after a significant family rupture. We started having coffee together after walks, and eventually our friendship expanded to occasional dinners, movie nights, and short weekend getaways. For the first time in a long time, I had a real friend, someone who cared about me for who I was, not what I could do for her. I also started taking pottery classes at the local community art school. I'd always admired pottery, but never had the time to learn. Now, every Thursday night, I spent 2 hours with my hands in the clay, creating bowls and vases and small sculptures. I wasn't good at it. Most of my creations came out warped or cracked in the kiln, but it didn't matter. The process was meditative. It forced me to be present in the moment, to focus solely on what my hands were doing. And in the rare moments when I managed to make something truly beautiful, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with pleasing someone else or meeting anyone's expectations. It was all my own, that little joy of creating something with my own hands. Months passed, and slowly the sharp pain of what had happened transformed into something more bearable. A deep sadness that was always there, but no longer stopped me from living. I continued working at the hospital, continued building friendships, continued discovering who I was outside the role of devoted mother and self-sacrificing grandmother. And then almost a year after that terrible day when David and Jennifer had tried to force me to sign those papers, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, but for some reason I decided to answer. On the other end of the line was Patricia, not my friend Patricia, but Patricia Denver's Jennifer's mother. She identified herself and asked if we could meet for coffee, saying she had something important to discuss with me. My first instinct was to decline. I didn't want to have any connection with anyone related to Jennifer and David. But something in her voice, a tone of urgency, and even anguish, made me agree. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown, a neutral place neither of us frequented regularly. When I got there, Patricia was already waiting at a table in the corner, fiddling nervously with her coffee cup. She looked older than I remembered the last time I'd seen her at Jennifer and David's wedding all those years ago, and there was a deep sadness in her eyes. I sat across from her and waited for her to begin speaking. What she told me over the next 2 hours completely changed my perspective on many things. Patricia began by apologizing, saying she'd only recently learned the full truth about what Jennifer and David had tried to do to me. She explained that in recent months, Jennifer had tried the same scheme on her, had appeared with similar documents, trying to convince her to transfer her house and assets. But Patricia, who was more skeptical and less emotionally manipulable than I had immediately seen through the plan and refused. When she confronted Jennifer about it, demanding to know where the idea came from, Jennifer eventually admitted everything, telling me how they'd tried to do the same to me, how I'd reacted, how it all went wrong. Patricia said she was horrified not only by what her daughter had tried to do to me, but by what it said about who Jennifer really was. She said she'd always known Jennifer had a tendency to be materialistic, always focused on having nice things and impressing others, but she never imagined her daughter would be capable of such calculated and cruel manipulation. Patricia asked me if I knew how much money David and Jennifer really had, what their true financial situation was. I said no, that I'd always assumed they were struggling when they asked me for money, that I believed it was temporary. Patricia shook her head sadly and told me it was all a lie. David had a very good job as an IT manager at a large company, earning over $120,000 a year. Jennifer also had a great salary as a marketing manager, probably around $80,000 a year. Together, they were earning over $200,000 a year, more than enough to live comfortably. But they had a serious spending problem, always buying things they couldn't really afford, always trying to maintain a lifestyle beyond their means. The BMW David drove was financed with huge installments. Their house had a huge mortgage because they'd taken out an extra loan on the equity to finance extravagant renovations, and Jennifer's designer handbags and clothes were all purchased on credit cards with sky-high interest rates. They had built up a mountain of debt, trying to appear more successful than they actually were, and instead of adjusting their spending to something more realistic, they had decided the solution was to take money from me, and now they were trying to take it from Patricia as well. Hearing all this was devastating in a new way. All that money I had given them, $202,000, representing decades of work and savings, hadn't gone to real needs. It hadn't helped pay essential bills or keep a roof over their heads. It had gone to sustain a luxurious lifestyle they hadn't earned, to buy things that were pure vanity and status. Every time David had called me saying he urgently needed money for the electricity bill or to buy food for Sophie, it had been a complete lie. And I had believed it because I wanted to believe it, because I couldn't imagine my own son would be capable of deceiving me like that. Patricia also told me that there were problems in David and Jennifer's marriage. Apparently, they fought constantly about money, about spending, about their mounting debts. Jennifer blamed David for not earning more. David blamed Jennifer for spending too much, but neither of them was willing to make the real changes necessary to get out of it. And Sophie, my poor granddaughter, was growing up in that toxic environment, listening to her parents fight, feeling the constant tension, learning completely distorted values about money and relationships. Patricia said she had thought long and hard before contacting me. She wasn't sure if it was her place to get involved, but she felt I deserved to know the truth. She also said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again after that encounter, since she was the mother of the person who had caused me so much harm. But I didn't feel angry at Patricia. She was as much a victim of the situation as I was a mother trying to understand how she had raised a daughter capable of such a thing. We talked a little more, sharing our experiences, our hurts, our fears about the future. And at the end of that conversation, something unexpected happened. We became friends. Patricia and I began meeting regularly after that, not to talk about about Jennifer and David, but simply to have each other's company. We discovered we had a lot in common. We were both strong women who had worked hard all our lives. We had both been exploited by people who should have loved us, and we were both trying to rebuild our lives and find joy again. She introduced me to her book club, and I invited her to pottery classes. Our lives intertwined in positive and healthy ways, and I was grateful for this unexpected friendship born from such difficult circumstances. More months passed, and I continued to receive occasional photos of Sophie by email. There were never messages, just the photos attached without any context. But I noticed things in the photos. Sophie was getting older now, 5, and in some of the more recent photos, she didn't look as happy as in the older ones. There was a sadness in her eyes that broke my heart, a tension in her little shoulders that no child her age should have. I mentioned this to Patricia during one of our meetings, and she confirmed that things at Jennifer and David's house were going from bad to worse. The arguments about money had become even more frequent and intense, and Sophie was definitely being affected by it all. Patricia had tried to talk to Jennifer about seeking marriage, counseling, or at least individual therapy to deal with the financial problems, but Jennifer had refused, insisting that everything would be fine if they just got more money. It was always about getting more money, never about changing the behavior patterns that created the problems in the first place. One day, about 15 months after that terrible confrontation in my office, I received a direct call from David for the first time since everything that had happened. When I saw his name appear on my phone screen, my first instinct was not to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered with a simple hello without any emotion in my voice. David sounded different, older, somehow more tired. He started the conversation awkwardly, asking how I was, how work was going, superficial things, as if we were casual acquaintances and not mother and son who had been through all that trauma. I responded equally superficially, keeping everything very neutral and factual. After a few minutes of that uncomfortable conversation, he finally got to the real point of the call. He said that he and Jennifer had reflected a lot on what had happened, that they recognized they might have been hasty in their approach, and that they would like to reconnect with me somehow. The words were carefully chosen. I noticed there was no real admission of guilt, no genuine apology, just this vague acknowledgement that they might have been hasty. I waited silently to see where he was going with this. David continued to say that Sophie was constantly asking about me, that she talked about Grandma Margaret all the time, that he and Jennifer had realized they were depriving their daughter of a meaningful relationship. He said that if I were interested, we could work out some kind of arrangement so I could see Sophie occasionally. My heart leaped at the prospect of seeing my granddaughter again, of being present in her life, but my mind was more skeptical. Why now? Why, after 15 months of almost complete silence, were they suddenly offering access to Sophie? I asked David directly what had changed, what had prompted this offer. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he answered. And when he finally did, his voice held a tone of defeat I'd never heard from him before. He said things had gotten very difficult financially, more difficult than they'd ever been. He said they'd accumulated debts they could no longer pay, that they were facing possible foreclosure on their house, that Jennifer had lost her job 3 months ago and wasn't finding anything new. And then came the real reason for the call, disguised as a family connection, but really just another attempt to get money. David asked if I would consider helping them again, saying they knew they didn't deserve my help after everything, but that they were desperate. He said they didn't want to lose their home, they didn't want Sophie to have to change schools. They didn't want to destroy what stability they had left in their lives. And in exchange for this help, they would guarantee I would have regular access to Sophie, that we could rebuild our relationship as a family. It was emotional blackmail at its purest, using my love for Sophie as a bargaining chip to get more money. And the saddest part was that David probably didn't even realize how wrong it was, how it demonstrated he hadn't learned anything yet. hadn't yet grasped how damaging his actions had been. I took a deep breath before responding, mentally preparing myself for what I needed to say. I told David I understood they were struggling, that I could imagine how stressful it must be to face such serious financial problems. But then I made it very clear that I wouldn't give them any money, not now, not ever again. I explained that I'd given them over $200,000 over the years and had never seen any return or even genuine gratitude for it. I said I'd learned that giving them money didn't really help, it only enabled them to continue destructive behavior patterns without facing the consequences of their choices. And as for Sophie, I made it clear that my relationship with my granddaughter could never be used as a bargaining chip. That if they truly cared about her well-being, they would let me see her regardless of financial concerns. David was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with barely contained anger. He said I was being selfish again, putting my pride above the family's well-being. He said that if I truly loved Sophie, I would do everything in my power to ensure she had a stable home. He tried to guilt-trip me, tried to emotionally manipulate me, just as he always did. But this time it didn't work. I calmly responded that I truly loved Sophie, and that was precisely why I wouldn't allow her parents to continue this cycle of financial irresponsibility. I told him the best thing I could do for my granddaughter was to model healthy boundaries and refuse to participate in destructive dynamics. And then before he could respond, before he could attempt any further manipulation, I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking after that conversation, my heart was racing, but there was also a feeling of strength, of personal power I'd never experienced before. I had said no. I had maintained my boundaries. I had protected myself even when I was being pressured with the thing that mattered most to me, my relationship with Sophie. And though it hurt, though every part of me wanted to give in and do anything to see my granddaughter, I knew I had done the right thing. Over the next few days, I received several text messages from Jennifer, each more desperate than the last. She tried to appeal to my empathy, describing in detail how Sophie cried at night for Grandma, how the girl was having nightmares about losing her house, how it would all be my fault if they ended up on the street. She tried to anger me, sending messages accusing me of being cruel and vindictive, saying I had never truly loved my son or granddaughter. She tried to bargain, offering to pay back some of the money I had given her over the years if I would just help with this latest emergency. Each message I received was a new emotional stab, but it was also a reminder of why I needed to maintain my boundaries. I showed all the messages to Robert, my lawyer, and he documented them in case we needed them in the future. I also showed them to Dr. Chen, my therapist, and we worked together to process the emotions they brought up. And then, after about a week of constant messages, everything abruptly stopped. There were no more calls, no more messages, no more emails. It was as if David and Jennifer had simply disappeared from my life. Part of me worried, wondering what had happened, if they were okay, if Sophie was safe. But Patricia kept me informed through her own channels. Apparently, after it became clear they couldn't get any more money from me, Jennifer had finally accepted a job not at the level she'd had before, but something that at least brought in some income. David had started doing freelance work on nights and weekends to supplement his salary. Most importantly, they had finally sought professional financial help, sitting down with a counselor who was helping them create a plan to deal with their debt and eventually stabilize their situation. It wasn't a magic solution. It would still take years to dig themselves out of the hole they dug, but at least it was a start. And all of this had only happened because I'd said no, because I'd refused to continue enabling destructive behavior. If I'd caved and given them more money, they never would have been forced to face the reality of their situation and take the necessary steps to change it. About 2 years after that terrible day when David and Jennifer tried to force me to sign those documents, I received an envelope in the mail. It had no return address, just my name and address, handwritten in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it curiously and found inside a letter from David. It was handwritten on plain paper with no special formatting, and the handwriting was hesitant, as if he had started and stopped several times as he wrote. The letter began with an apology, finally a genuine apology after all this time. David wrote that it had taken him a long time to truly understand what he had done, to see beyond his own needs and desires and acknowledge how much he had hurt me. He said he had started therapy and was working through many things, including his relationship with money, his expectations of what was owed to him, and the behavioral patterns he had developed over the years. He wrote about how he was only now beginning to understand how much I had sacrificed for him when he was growing up. How much $202,000 truly represented in terms of work and time and life dedicated to earning that money. He apologized for trying to take even more, for using Sophie as an emotional weapon against me, for all the lies and manipulation. And then he wrote something that made me cry when I read it. He said he didn't expect my forgiveness, that he understood if I could never trust him again, that he had broken something precious that might never be completely repaired. But he said he wanted me to know that he was genuinely sorry, that he was working to become a better person, and that he hoped one day to be able to demonstrate through actions, not just words, that he had truly changed. The letter ended by saying that if I were interested, he would like to invite me to coffee somewhere, public of my choosing, with no expectations, no requests, just a chance to talk as please. Human beings trying to navigate a difficult situation. I read that letter over and over, looking for signs of manipulation, looking for the patterns I had learned to recognize. But it felt genuine, felt different from anything David had said to me before. I shared it with Dr. Chen at our next session, and we worked together to assess whether I was ready for this kind of contact, what my boundaries and expectations would be, and how I would protect myself if it turned out to be just another manipulation. Eventually, I decided to accept the invitation, but on my own terms. I responded to the letter saying I was willing to meet, but made it clear it would only be a conversation, that there were no promises about where it might lead, and that absolutely no discussion of money or financial support would be tolerated. I arranged to meet at the coffee shop where Patricia and I met frequently, a place where I felt comfortable and safe. And so on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks later, I sat at a table in that coffee shop and waited for my son to arrive. When David walked in and saw me, something crossed his face that looked genuinely like embarrassment. He walked to the table slowly, almost hesitantly, and asked permission before sitting down. He looked thinner than I remembered, more tired, older. But there was also something different in his eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there before. We talked for almost 3 hours that day. David told me about the therapy he was in, about the difficult things he was having to face about himself. He talked about how his marriage with Jennifer was in a complicated place, how they were trying to work together, but it was difficult, how years of fighting about money had created deep wounds. He talked about Sophie, about what an incredible and resilient child she was, despite everything, about how he was trying to be a better father to her. And he talked about me, about his memories of growing up, about how he was only now understanding things from my perspective. I listened more than I spoke in that first meeting, still cautious, still guarded. But I shared a bit about my own journey over the past 2 years, about the therapy, about the new friendships, about how I had learned to live for myself. And when we finished and got ready to leave, David asked if I would be willing to meet again in a few weeks. I said yes, but again, I made it clear that it would be slow, that trust had to be rebuilt through time and consistent actions. That was the beginning of something new between Davy and me, a return to our previous relationship, because that was irrevocably broken, but perhaps the building of something different. We began meeting once a month, always in public places, always for a limited time. The conversations became easier over time, more honest, deeper. David kept his word about not asking for money. Never once in all our meetings did he mention finances or hint at needing help. And slowly, very slowly, I began to believe that perhaps his change was real. After about 6 months of these monthly meetings, David asked me if I would like to see Sophie. I said I had talked to Jennifer about it, that I had made it clear to her that my relationship with my granddaughter had nothing to do with money or favors, and that Jennifer had agreed that it would be good for Sophie to have her grandmother back in her life. My heart sank when he extended that invitation. Sophie, my little Sophie, now 7 years old, whom I hadn't seen in person for over 2 years. Of course, I wanted to see her more than anything in the world, but I was also afraid it would be too painful afraid. Sophie wouldn't remember me anymore, afraid this was just another trap. David must have seen the fear on my face because he quickly added that he understood my concerns, that we could do it gradually, that I could think about it and decide in my own time. But I didn't need time to think. I knew my answer immediately. Yes, I wanted to see Sophie no matter how scary or complicated it was. We scheduled it for the following Saturday at the same park where Sophie and I used to play before everything fell apart. When I arrived at the park that Saturday morning, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. And then I saw them, David and Sophie, walking down the path toward me. Sophie had grown so much taller, thinner, no longer the chubby little girl I remembered. But when our eyes met, when she recognized me, her whole face lit up with a huge smile. She let go of her father's hand and ran toward me, screaming, "Grandma Grand." That seemed to satisfy her for the time being, and soon we were playing on the swing and talking about school and friends. And all the simple, important things that fill a 7-year-old's life. David stayed away for the most part, giving us space, but I could see him watching us with an expression that seemed to be a mix of relief and sadness. That day at the park was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. David and I established an arrangement where I would see Sophie twice a month, always supervised at first. But eventually, after several months of consistency, I was able to have time alone with her. Jennifer and I never rebuilt any kind of relationship, and honestly, we didn't even want to. But we managed to be civil with each other for Sophie's sake. We managed to coordinate schedules and make arrangements without unnecessary drama. Today, for years after that terrible day in my living room when I almost lost everything, I can say that my life is in a place I never imagined possible. I'm now 67. I retired from the hospital a year ago, and I'm living my life on my own terms for the first time. I see Sophie regularly. I have a cautious but improving relationship with David, and I have a wonderful circle of friends who support and value me. Financially, I'm stable, not rich, but comfortable with enough to live with dignity and even travel a little. I finally managed to take that trip to Europe I've always wanted. I spent 3 weeks last year visiting museums in Paris and London, and it was magical. I still take pottery classes, my pieces have improved significantly, and I even sold some at a local craft fair. Patricia and I are still very close. She's become more than a friend. She's become like a sister I chose. And perhaps most importantly, I've learned to value myself, to set boundaries, to say no when necessary. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean allowing yourself to be taken advantage of. That being generous doesn't mean being a victim, that caring for your family doesn't mean destroying yourself in the process. Looking back now, I can clearly see all the signs I ignored, all the moments I should have questioned, all the times I put others' needs so far above my own that I forgot my needs mattered too. But I regret nothing, because all that pain and confusion and loss brought me here to this place of strength and self-knowledge. And as for the money, the $202,000 I'll never get back. I learned to see it as the cost of a very valuable education. It was expensive, painfully expensive, but it taught lessons about self-worth, healthy boundaries, and the importance of protecting not only your money, but your dignity and peace of mind. If you're reading this story or listening to this story right now, if you're going through something similar, if you have people in your life who constantly take from you without giving anything in return, if you feel guilty every time you consider setting boundaries, I want you to know that you're not alone. This happens more often than we think, and it's not your fault. You're not weak for trusting, you're not foolish for helping, you're not a bad person for finally saying enough. Seeking help isn't betrayal. Protecting isn't selfishness. Saying no isn't a lack of love. If you identified with my story, please like this video to help me reach more people who may need to hear this message. In the comments, tell me which part resonated most with you, or share your own experience if you feel comfortable doing so. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe for more. Real stories about family challenges, overcoming obstacles, and finding strength in difficult times. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear that it's okay to protect yourself, that it's okay to set boundaries, that it's okay to finally put your own needs first.